Welcome to Team Talk from Team Kinetic, the podcast that takes a deeper dive into volunteer management with me, Chris Martin. Welcome to Team Talk from Team Kinetic with me, Chris Martin, where we get to know someone who's trying to make a bit of a difference to volunteers and volunteering. And today's guest is very much a good example of someone who's really trying to make a difference by invigorating a whole city to volunteer. Claire Troup is Project Manager at Manchester City Council's Volunteer Inspire programme, otherwise known as Manchester VIP. Welcome to the pod, Claire. We always like to start with getting to know you a little bit in these podcasts, and trying to understand a little bit about how you've ended up in this random world of volunteer management. To try and understand people's different journeys into becoming a volunteer manager. So I guess, start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about how you've ended up as a volunteer manager for Manchester City Council.
I've worked at the council for about 16 years now in a variety of roles, things like child protection, environmental strategy, lots of different roles. And my previous to this job that I've moved into about 9 months ago, I was in a neighbourhood team, so that's very much a frontline service, and you're out in communities working with local ward members to deliver improvements within communities. A lot of our work was framed around what's known as the Our Manchester strategy, which is a 10-year strategy for the city. And that's around, there's lots of elements to that, but it's very much around starting from strengths and how we can really maximise the positives and some of the ideas and capacity that's already there within communities and how we build on that. So that's my last job was based within the neighbourhood teams. And as part of that, you work with the community and volunteers a lot. So that really sort of sparked my interest in that area of work. And then when this job, this opportunity came up, I thought it sounds really interesting. I felt like I had the base of good experience to build on that, and we'd known about Manchester VIP for some time within the neighbourhood services, and then felt like a really good move for me to give it a go and see whether I could drive and develop the project.
Brilliant. And was there anything particular about sort of the world of volunteering that was of interest to you when you first sort of got involved?
I suppose it's quite eye-opening, really, just how much volunteers do, and maybe it can be something that as a council, as somebody in a work setting, we take for granted. So actually, it's quite overwhelming, particularly over the pandemic, how much volunteers made a real difference to communities.
Yeah.
And actually, they're just there behind the scenes. So it was quite an eye-opener, really. And just looking at the variety of volunteering that goes on now, it's massive. There's so much happening across the city. So yeah, it's quite inspiring, really, that people are doing so much.
It's an interesting one for us as an organisation, because when you work with the sort of the charitable sector, there's an awful lot of the volunteer managers that are in there that have ended up in there because of their own personal history or experience. They've got a relationship, or they're cause driven. And then when you come over to sort of the local authority side, where people have sort of ended up there from a career path perspective, it's one of these sort of areas we think is really interesting as to the role of the volunteer manager. If we're going to sort of move this sector on, the professionalisation of the volunteer manager's skills.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder what your thoughts were around that, and how well you felt prepared specifically for the job itself, and then the support around that. If you were aware of anything that might have been there to support you, what your thoughts were around the job of volunteer manager, what your expectations were before you got it, and now that you're in it, how well those two things match, I guess, is the question.
I suppose for me, because my role is a project manager, that sort of framed what I thought I would be doing, and therefore there's some transferable skills in that, isn't there? So I've tried to bring over some of that experience that I've got in my previous roles and apply that to this. But I didn't, I knew about Manchester VIP, as I said. I knew about that system. I knew about MAC, that's working within Manchester as well, but I didn't have any massive expectations in terms of what being a volunteer manager is and what that involves. And there's there's different levels, isn't there, in terms of that? You've got those community organisations working really hyper locally,
Yeah.
and there's volunteer management happening there, and then you've got the larger organisations like the MLCO and City Council, MAC, etc., that are looking at it in a wider context. So I suppose once you get into volunteer management, you realise how much is going on, and actually there's quite a lot of overlap. And I think trying to sort of navigate some of that has been quite interesting. And I think thinking about it from the volunteers' perspective, how they volunteer and how they access that volunteering is something that maybe we need to sort of get a little bit better at, from a sort of city council and partnership approach.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's another good one as well. What we, and I think you'll testify to this, is the city council is quite good on the strategic side of it, what they want to achieve as a city. But as you rightly just said there, sometimes the disconnect between what they want to do and then the realities of what's going on the ground can be quite a tricky sort of set of ideas to align as to this is the ambition versus this is the reality of what we've actually got to deal with day to day.
And it changes so much, doesn't it? That local, what's happening on the ground does change so quickly in all areas. That's the world we live in now, but certainly the voluntary sector. So I think it's been really interesting, and I suppose I'm still learning some of that. I'm still relatively new. I can't keep saying I'm new to role, but I am quite new. So it's quite interesting for me to sort of understand that.
Well, I guess just for anybody who's listening, would you like to explain a little bit about the sort of brief history of the Manchester VIP from sort of your understanding of it?
Yeah, so it developed following the Commonwealth Games, because it was a sports offer. So there was lots of people interested in volunteering and took part in volunteering when we had the Commonwealth Games in the city. And so it was a means to capture all those volunteers. And then in 2018-19, it moved then from a single service approach to across what we call the Neighbourhoods Directorate within the City Council. So at that point, the offer was extended out to cover volunteering opportunities in parks and green spaces, in what we call our neighbourhood teams, libraries and galleries, and the sports and leisure, so Manchester Active as it's known now. So at that point, those services within the Neighbourhood Directorate signed up to using Manchester VIP, and the volunteer opportunities then became much broader. So that's how it's been working since that point. So it's basically a brokerage offer. So it's very much framed around linking people that want to volunteer. They don't have to live in Manchester to opportunities to take part in volunteering within the Manchester boundaries.
And I guess when you go from a more targeted sort of specific offer, which was where it was sports and major events when it first sort of started, it grew very strong in that one particular sector. What's been the big challenges as you rolled out across, a city approach at Manchester's scale and size? What are the big challenges you face with that?
I think it's been difficult the challenges have been around that uptake within those areas that have joined Manchester VIP at a later time, and thinking about the formal. It's not a formal process, but it's a more formal way of monitoring and managing volunteers than perhaps we had previously. So moving that into services that are very busy, that are going through lots of changes, lots of staff changes and whatever else, priority changes. So that's been a challenge, I think. When it first came into being and it was first extended across those services, it did start to be the uptake, and then obviously the pandemic came, and that obviously the opportunities the opportunities to volunteer just weren't there. You couldn't go to a library, the libraries weren't open, for example. So all of that, the momentum sort of stopped at that point, really. And we're just, I feel like probably the last couple of months, that we started to move on from that, and the activities definitely increased in terms of the opportunities for people.
And when you sort of took this approach, this more citywide approach, and you're trying to get these services on board, is there any hints or tips that you could sort of share with everybody who might be listening as to how you engage, like I say, really busy services that are already stretched enough, in many cases, to become to offer a slightly more formal volunteer offer when they've sort of been getting away in some cases with a more ad hoc approach? Is there anything you've learned from the last couple of months of trying to get people on board and creating opportunities?
Certainly have your champions within your services. So we have a user group, which is they're really key to help me in terms of that messaging and keeping Manchester VIP and volunteering on the agenda. So we have reps from each of the services that we're working with, and we meet regularly, trying to think about making it as simple as possible for people, selling the benefits of using a system like Manchester VIP versus not. And for me, there's some key positives in terms of data collection, data protection, streamlining services, the impact on people's time and all that sort of stuff that I think been trying to sort of promote within those services and with the communities that we're working with, and just getting out there and speaking to people, making sure we've got good comms, making sure our social media's working well, making sure people have got access to any training and support they need, things like revising all the manuals we've got, help tips and help sheets.
It sounds quite dry, doesn't it? But it's all the important stuff to that foundation needs to be there, and the support materials, and someone at the end of the phone when they've got a problem needs to be. You need to have be in that position that if someone's stuck with something, you can be there to help them quite quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And just getting out at events, I've been out at a few things recently, the team, things like our staff conference, but also community facing events. So they're really important, just to get out there, have a stall, talk to people about volunteering and what we do.
And I guess it might be worth talking as well about, letting people know the size of your team when it comes to, you've got this quite big agenda for volunteering for Manchester. Mm-hmm. It might be worth to share with people, who's involved in that from your standpoint.
So there is a responsible officer for the project who's a strategic lead in neighbourhoods who also leads on volunteering. There's myself, and then we have a business support officer, Joe, working on the project full time, and that's our team. That's our core team. But then we're supported, as I said, by the user group.
Yep.
So they have their day-to-day job, but they also pick up Manchester VIP on behalf of their teams.
So it's a challenge. Yeah, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. Yes.
Yeah. You've got a lot of people to speak to there. And one of the things that when we look at the sort of the difference between our more traditional sort of charitable sector clients versus our local authority clients is exactly what you just said there. In the local authority, often you are quite arm's length from the services, and that being able to encourage them and support them is often the big challenge when they've got lots and lots of other competing things for their attention. Priorities. That's the one I was looking for.
I think we have a board as well, which is really helpful. So we've got that strategic buy-in. I think that has reps from all of the services that are signed up with Manchester VIP, along with comms as well. So I think having that buy-in at that level is really helpful for the project.
So I'm thinking for you personally, as you're like I say, you're still new, but you're not dead new. What do you think maybe would be helpful for yourself in terms of professional development and support to help you with the job? Is there anything out there from the voluntary sector that would be useful to have, or anything sort of you've identified as thinking, it'd been helpful to know that before I started?
I think some of the work that we've started, Chris, a few months ago around developing that network of volunteer managers across the city, I think that's really helpful, because particularly if you're new to this area, just hearing their stories and learning from each other is really helpful. So that's useful, and I think that's something that building that network would help, I think.
I mean, that in itself for Manchester is a job on its own, isn't it? If you think you've got the museums, you've got the parks, you've got the services that are related to the local authority but not delivered by the local authority, it's a substantial network of organisations that have some kind of volunteer element, and you've got the sort of the other body, which is MAC, which is the local volunteer centre and third. So it is a substantial network of people and organisations that are doing stuff, and the city council plays this really interesting role in the middle of this, potentially enablers and facilitators, but also doing their own thing with their own volunteering. So it's a sort of a really dynamic picture as to what's going on across the city, I think.
Yeah, and I think for volunteers, for new and existing volunteers, we need to make it as simple as possible at that front door, so that they feel that no matter what route they come in, it needs to be, sensible and easy for them to access what they want to get involved with.
Yeah.
So the challenge for us is to make sure there's really good opportunities that people want to take part in, and we're getting volunteers signed up, and they find that system really easy, and they can access what they want to do when they want to do it. I think that's really key on what is quite a complex picture locally and wider than that.
If you were, where would you go and ask for sort of support and help on this kind of thing? Where are your go-to people when you're a bit like, what do I do about this, or what's the next step here? Is there have you got sort of that support structure around you? Because it is something that our work, we spoke to a couple of guys from the Association of Volunteer Managers in some of the earlier podcasts, and they acknowledge that the traditional voluntary sector sort of support mechanisms don't support local authorities. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on where you would go to if you had a question about, I don't know, a particular sort of structure or process for, setting up a volunteer strategy for the city, for example. Who's the...
I'd probably go to who you talk to who you know, don't you? Who I know in the city council, and then I might ask yourself, Chris, and say, do you know, have you got any links? I might speak to my colleagues in MAC and just sort of find my way, really. I wouldn't say there's any formal, I'd speak to my line manager and everything. I don't think there is any formal sort of structure around that. But yeah, I'd speak to policy about a strategy and sort of start from there and see how I got on, really.
And like say, you sort of, how long have you been doing it now? Did you start? You started before COVID, didn't you?
No,
you just started,
October last year.
October last year. That was it. And so so you come in just over 6 months into the post. How are you finding it?
It's great. It's been really interesting, actually. I've learned loads, and I've done it. It's a minefield. Like I said, I think it's a minefield. Understanding the system has been really, useful and at times challenging for me, because I'm not necessarily very good at technology, but I've found my way around it, and I feel really confident using that. So that's been really helpful, and I can help people and signpost people appropriately. But yeah, it's been really interesting, and there's a lot to do, I suppose. I think there's, it feels like a really good project, a really interesting and meaningful and worthwhile thing to be involved in, and I just want to sort of keep the momentum going with it, really.
This is another thing that we often, this is across all sort of voluntary sector organisations and people that use volunteers, is how do you tell your story? What have you found? I know you're, like I say, only about 6 months in, but have you found any sort of effective way to be able to tell your story back to sort of the senior stakeholders in the project to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten about and volunteering doesn't end up as another sort of side item like it was maybe before the pandemic? The pandemic was an amazing shop window for what volunteers could do in the community, I think. But how do you as a volunteer manager to help continue keeping volunteering and the importance of volunteers at the sort of the top of that agenda at a local authority level?
I think being able to influence things like the service plans, making sure that it's cited, it's in there. Manchester VIP volunteering's within people's priorities for their service area and their team action plans. That board membership and having a good board that's bought into the project. Thinking about some of the KPIs we're getting off our system, and I know we've been reviewing some of that to make sure they work for what we need as a city council, and also each of those services, so that we can report up and we can report to teams about the impacts of volunteering. Thinking about linking in with those volunteers a bit more and getting some of those stories from volunteers, I think is really powerful, but also from the providers. So I know that's something that I want to develop with our comms team, and try to do a bit of that around Volunteers Week, so get some little stories from people over that week. So things like that, really. But I think I suppose it's all things like having a blog and doing things. This is a good idea, isn't it?
You said you weren't technical. You mentioned Manchester, and I mean Manchester's quite dynamic when it comes to things like this. I think it is quite forward thinking as a city. How does that sort of strategic sort of approach and this sort of corporate goal of the city council to have more local community involvement, how's that sort of helped, and how's that play into your ability to get the right people in the rooms when you need them, like I said, on the board and things like that?
I think if you look at some of the priorities of the strategy, it really fits with some of the aspirations of of the projects. So if you when you go on our website, it's all branded around the Our Manchester. It's really it's informed and influenced by that strategy, I think, all the way through. It's about people within those communities making positive change and feeling able to influence and support what's happening locally. So it definitely feeds through what we're doing as a project. We have Our Manchester Investment Board, and we report up to them as well, so that they're cited on the programme and what we're doing. So I do think it's just been reviewed at year 5. It's a 10-year strategy, so we've got 4.5 years left of that
Still a bit of
strategy
time to go.
Yeah, but it'll be here before we know it, won't it?
It will.
But yeah, it definitely. I've mentioned the service plans a couple of minutes ago. They'll be all being reviewed at the moment, and if you look at those on the website, you can see that volunteering, the voluntary sector is referenced and is key to that throughout. So it's really important that we put some focus and time and prioritize that work where we can.
Yeah, brilliant. So you are where you are now. You've got your 6 months. What does the future look like for Manchester VIP?
I think what we really trying to get teams using Manchester VIP as business as usual. So every time, really increasing the take up and use of it within our teams, and then it's about growing it out in the community. That's one of the key areas of work at the moment. And also just thinking a bit more about the volunteers and their journey. So I'd like to do some work around incentives, but rather than just buying a load of stuff, thinking about what would volunteers want, as part of their volunteering journey. Is it training? Is it a lanyard? Is it access to X, Y, and Z? So I think that's a piece of work that we want to do over the summer.
It's such an interesting area, that I think, especially again when you take that local authority standpoint with it, because people's motivations for being involved as volunteers and your system are often, like you say, hyper local. They're community driven, and we know volunteers are generally that may not be their primary reason, but in their top 3 reasons, it's that egalitarian, wanting to give back, wanting to do something for their community. But it is also really important to acknowledge and reward and recognise the hard work the volunteers do. So it's trying to get that balance right of reward versus recognition. Where do you just need to recognise versus where can you actually reward, and what that reward is really quite a tricky thing to get right, I think, because it does change audience to audience, and having a sort of a choice of awards that you can a menu that you can use to motivate the most appropriate communities with them is a really, it's a tricky thing to do, and it's like I say, you can end up spending quite a bit of money on it as a local authority if you're not careful and not get the outcome that you want. So have you got any thoughts about how you're going to do that?
I think for me, I'd like to actually talk to our volunteers. So, some sort of survey, some sort of, having conversations with people. Appreciate we've got a lot of volunteers with us, so need to think about how we do that. And then, like you said, it may vary according to what people are doing. Sports incentives might be different to a library's incentive. So I do think as well, we have a working skills team within the city council. So there's something around that added, volunteering and how that impacts on your experience and skills, whether that helps you to move into employment or training or all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's something that would like to have a think about. And I think one of the other areas as well is around people's volunteer leave. So the city council has volunteer leave, and a lot of other organisations do as well.
I was just about to ask you about that. That was going to be my next question, actually.
Right.
So it's like almost like a prepped you with these questions before.
You didn't. So that's something as well, I think, that would be useful to explore, and how people can, with lots of skills, can actually support local groups and organisations working on the ground.
The danger with the 3 days leave is you've got an awful lot of people in the local authority that have got a particular set of skills that would be really useful for smaller local organisations and charitable groups and mutual aid groups to benefit from. but sometimes making it so it fits in the 3 days leave they have is a bigger job than it's sort of, it almost becomes overwhelming to try and organise all that. So I can see how that's a definite. It's got such potential, but it's also such a technical challenge, logistical challenge to try and engage the staff to use those skills appropriately, rather than just sending them out to paint a fence for a day, which is having the treasurer of the city doing that feels like a waste of their skills, and they could be doing something so much more impactful.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it is about just telling MCC or any staff that this is here, and if you proactively look, you can find something that would potentially suit the skills you've got. Areas of the council now built into their procurement, they have social value. It's all there. So how that's used, one avenue could be volunteering. So I think there's a big area of work around that as well. We have like certain priorities and programs happening across the city. So in Manchester, this 2022 is our year. So that's a year focused around young people.
Okay.
So again, there's lots of activity happening across the city focused on young people. And again, there could be opportunities to volunteer to support some of that across the next 6 months.
I mean, the current trends are that we've seen a 5-fold increase in younger people volunteering, and the more traditional audience has dropped away on the back of COVID. But we're seeing a real explosion in youth volunteering, because it's been so heavily encouraged by universities, schools, colleges. But the type of opportunities those guys want to do are slightly different to the type of opportunities that my dad wants to do, who's 73 years of age and goes to the local golf club, and that's where he volunteers. So it's it's a challenge, I think, to make sure you've got the right opportunity types available for what people are looking for, and they're flexible enough and short enough to suit the audience, but they're not so expensive for you to put those things on that they become a problem in and of themselves, that you're not getting the value of money you need back from the volunteer, so to speak, the return on investment for the effort that goes in. So last question, we're nearly there. How about for you personally? What you've now had a taste of this world of volunteer management? Is there anything particular for you that you want to sort of to develop or grow?
I think I don't do any formal volunteering.
Oh, here we go. There we go.
See, that's
the big reveal right at the end of the podcast.
I know. I don't, and I do think I should really do some volunteering, particularly now my children are a little bit older, and I have that ability, a bit more time on my hands. So I would like
I
to
can't wait for them days. When does that start? I want to know when that little time in your hands starts.
Yeah, so I do generally go and do some litter picking and stuff at the end of the road and in the green space and stuff. So I do a little bit, but nothing formal. So I think I need to, I should make more use of my time and do some volunteering. I think that would be something I need to do.
All right, well, when we get you on the podcast again next year, we'll follow you up on that and see
how. Yeah. Practice what I preach, I think.
Yeah, well, there you go. Don't do as I do. Do as I say.
Yeah,
you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Claire, for your time. It's been lovely to hear about the work you're doing in Manchester, and we'll speak to you again in the future and see how you're getting on.